Okay, we're back, we're live, we're here with Rhett Butler, and he is a geophysicist and seismologist.
Seismologist, yes.
From HIGP, and an old friend of ThinkTech for sure.
Yeah, always enjoy coming on.
Yeah, we'd love to have you
pleasure.
here, Rhett. Yeah.
Also nice to run into you at other conferences and
Yes,
have you guys.
and we have done that.
Yeah, that was very pleasant.
Major schmoozing. That was last year in January. That was Pacific Telecommunications Conference, PTC, going strong in Hawaii for, what, at least 20 years?
Yeah, I hope it continues.
And bringing people from all over the world to talk about telecommunications. And I hope that through that conference, they fix the broadband in Hawaii. But I am not all that confident about it yet.
Now, they need more cables into Hawaii.
They do. And more among the islands.
Yeah, exactly. Not so easy to do.
Yeah. We have Skype. We do Skype everywhere. And
I do Skype all over the world.
Oh, sure. Professionally, you would do that. Talk to your colleagues.
Yeah. We just a week ago had a multi-conference call on Skype, and you have to sort out the little details of getting it all working. But once it's all working, it's fantastic.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and on that point, we're talking about predicting earthquakes today. Science
Not
is.
me.
You're not going to talk about that?
Not predicting. I
then?
don't like the prediction word.
Okay, forget that word.
Forecast.
Forecasting. Okay, change that. Forecasting. Okay. We're going to find out the difference here in a minute. But point is that, in that business,
right,
to appreciate sort of global phenomena, you have got to have a global network. You've got to be able to talk to your colleagues everywhere and figure out what it's like for them so you can come to some global conclusions to make global forecasts.
Right. Better word, see? Forecast.
So how does a geologist work with a seismologist in order to make those forecasts? Where do you get the data, for example?
Well, in seismology, it's a global science. It's always been one in the sense that you can't study earthquakes around the planet unless everybody shares data. So it's a unique group that actually share data amongst each other. Many other sciences really don't do that. So that's one of the foundations. But on the other hand, in terms of the seismic data, you got to have a reference to the time scales. And so if you can relate your data that you're looking at to things that have happened in the past, then you can get an idea of what potentially might happen in the future. So it's linking kind of the observation of earthquakes occurring all over the globe in certain areas, these so-called subduction zones where the plates are bouncing into each other. And then you try to relate that to what we've seen in the past, what we call paleo-tsunami or paleo-seismic, which means it occurred before history. You can't go to a history book to find it out. You got to go out and look at the soil. You got to look for layers that suggest that these things have happened before. And you can date those with working with radiocarbon or uranium thorium. And then you can get an idea of when these things happened in the past and then relate them to the processes we see today. So in that sense, you can put a time scale in it because you see events and you can date them and they occurred with a certain frequency in the past and they're relatable to what we're looking at today, and it gives you a sense of the time scale of things. So that's the difference between prediction and forecasting here. Is in forecasting, we're trying to take the information and say, based upon this, the probabilities that we can see one of these things is just like your weather forecast. But we're not saying on June 31st, there will be a magnitude 7 at this location. It's a different thing.
Predictions are not really scientific. Forecasting is scientific.
Yeah, forecasting we can do, it's solid stuff. Prediction, we don't yet quite have the basis and all the data to make these kinds of things that people expect once we are predicting, if that ever happens.
Yeah.
You'll have some feeling like, well, there's a solid basis for this. We don't quite have that basis yet.
I might think the prediction is something that Merlin the magician would do.
Yeah. Well, that'd be great. I don't know whether Merlin can see, 30 days into the future, and then you write it down, and then you can definitely predict
all set.
it.
Yeah.
But that's not the same thing as trying to do it scientifically.
Well, this may oversimplify your science, but I'm thinking like a program. For example, I like to build an if statement here.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So I'd like to make an if statement that at the end of the if statement, if all the conditions are met, then I think there's going to be an earthquake within some period of time, some relatively short-term period of time. So what I'd like to ask you is,
Sure.
what's in the if statement? If I find this, and this, then I'm going to believe, then I have reason to believe that there's going to be an event.
Woo. If statement.
Just give us some of the conditions. It does not have to be all of them.
I don't usually think about earthquake prediction whatsoever.
Not predictions,
Yeah.
forecast.
But for forecasting, I mean, you're basically trying to tie, for instance, my recent study, which I came in part to talk about, is how often can a magnitude 9 earthquake happen? Well, why does that matter? Well, because if you got a really big earthquake like that, not only does it do local damage, but it'll make a tsunami that will hit Hawaii. So it'd be kind of nice to know how often these things can happen. But if you haven't seen one, well, how do you answer that question? Okay.
Yeah, we haven't had one.
Right, we haven't had one in our
had
historical
sevens.
period. Yeah, we've had 7s.
Have we had 8s?
Well, we've had tsunamis from 8s from a number of different places, and they have done a lot of damage in the islands. But as I talked about a year ago, there are areas in the Aleutian Islands, just because of the nature of the way the earthquakes happen, that they send all the energy from the tsunami right toward us. So it would be nice to have some idea what's the probability for that to happen. So how do you do that? That's part of what the forecasting is all about.
Yeah.
So in part, you have to convince yourself that it could happen, okay? And if you just look at the earthquakes along the Aleutians, and there have been 8, 6s, and 9s, and different, well, there have been magnitude 9s up there already. So there would be little surprise that you could get a magnitude 9. Well, but where's the history? And that's where you have to say, okay, there's a chance you could get a 9, and then you look to yourself around the whole planet. Well, how often do they happen? Well, since 1900. And you pick 1900 because that's when instrumental seismology starts. In other words, before then we didn't have a lot of seismograms. You don't really have any hard data. So at 1900, there's enough stuff out there that you can say, okay, that was a magnitude 7. We have records of these things. We can say how big they are. And with some confidence, we can say, well, this is the rate that we're seeing these things. So since 1900, we've had 5 magnitude 9s, okay? That's about 115 years, so a little over once every 20 years. And then the question is, well, was the last 115 years unique in any way? Well, if it wasn't unique in any way, then, well, we could expect to have 5 before that in the century before, and we'll probably have 5 in the century after. It's not an unreasonable assumption. That's simply an assumption that we've seen nothing special, that they happen, okay? Now the question is, okay, you take those 9s and then say, well, how often will that happen in the Aleutians up there? Well, to get to that point, you have to say, well, what is your model? And of course, we have our plate tectonics model. The plates are moving. So you might have some feeling like, well, the faster it's converging, maybe it's more likely you'll have an earthquake.
Subduction.
Subduction, right. The actual Pacific plate moving under the Aleutians, the faster that's moving, or if it's hitting straight on, or if it's hitting at an angle. That angle matters because that also affects how much is going down. And then if you have a big long stretch of plate where you can have earthquakes in many places, well, it's more probable than that. So you can take those things into account. You can say, well, let's just take into account the length that we're worried about, and the rate that it's subducting, and the angle that it's actually coming in at, and measure that for all the subduction zones around the world, and say, okay, about every 115, at 115 years, we're going to have 5 sprinkled around the world. And if they could be anywhere in our subduction zone system, well, what are the chances? Well, you relate that to the rate, and you relate that to the direction, and you relate that to the length, and you can come up with a percentage. So it might be that at that part of the Aleutians, that the probability is twice as great as some other part of the world, or half as great. But if you just say, if it's going to happen 5 every 115 years, well, you can actually put a number on what that rate would be. You'd say, well, it's actually, if you make the numbers measurement, it's about 1 chance in 10 over about 50 years. So over 50 years, magnitude 9s, we're going to have so many of them. And it would be about 1 chance in 10 over the Aleutians to get another 9.
But you're talking about a location in the world.
Yeah.
So you put your probability on locations then. That's important because that would not be Hawaii for a number 9. We haven't had that
We're not going to
experience.
get a 9 here because we don't have a subduction zone.
Right.
We're out in the middle of the Pacific, but we have subduction zones all around us. And we've seen a 9 at Tohoku, and we've seen a 9 in Alaska in '64, and we've seen a 9 in Chile and Sumatra and Kamchatka. Well, those are bad, but they're not the worst case. Let's look at the case in the Aleutians and say, well, what's the chance of a 9 there?
Yeah.
Well, if you just, that very, very simple model suggests that it's about 1 in 10 for the next 50 years.
Okay.
So that's a model, okay? It doesn't answer the question. That's a model. Well, how do you validate your model? Well, that's the other part that I was talking about. You have to actually go out to the sites of the earthquakes and find the evidence for how often they have occurred. So if this works at all, and you plug the numbers in for Tohoku, it should predict that, gee, since Tohoku, the prior one was about 869 AD, and that's a little over 1,300 years or so. Well, and you go and you can measure that in the paleo tsunami data, and you get the same numbers as your model, it gives you some feeling that your model's, it's not perfect, but it's in the right direction.
You'd like to have a model that was constructed on the same data that we can get now, but you don't have that data from 1,000 years ago.
Right.
How do you get any data about what was happening
Well, what you
1,000
do
years
is
ago?
that you use the 5 9s that have occurred, and there is data for those, and learn about what their repeat rates are. Compare that to the model I just said. If they agree, then your model has now more validity. It's got actual data behind it that was not in any way in part of building the model. In other words, we took very simply that there were 5 9s since 1900. There's plate tectonics convergence. There's the angle it goes at, and there's how big the
We
fault.
know all that.
We can pull that out, plug a number into the model, gives you a number. Then the question is, how well does that fit? And specifically, how does that fit for the 5 9s we've already seen? So, because we've been doing science for a long time, there's a lot of literature out there. And so you can go through the literature.
Global, all over the world, people collecting data.
But really, people have really been looking at these big 9s. So if you could go to Tohoku, they've done the excavations, and they've found...
Where is Tohoku exactly?
Tohoku is eastern Honshu. It's where the Great Japan earthquake happened in 2011, okay? So they've been in the Sendai Plain, which was the main effect. That's where the Fukushima nuclear plant was. And you basically, you can either drill down or core down or build a trench. And you can find layers many kilometers inland, which says that there were tsunamis in the past in this location that were really huge. And then you can date those with carbon-14 dating, where you're measuring little bits and pieces of things, and then you bracket the age.
How can I, so I core down.
Yeah.
I core down in the earth, and I'm looking for some kind of sign that at this point down in the earth, and at this point with carbon dating, whatever it is, there was a number 9.
Yeah,
But how do you tell that?
Well, I mean, for instance, you're looking for marine deposits, okay? So you're on land, you're kilometers from the ocean. Okay, people are farming, doing whatever, and so there's always mulch and stuff grow as the surface level rises. But if you have a big tsunami come in, it's going to dump what we call a marine layer, which is a bunch of shells and sand and all this stuff. And so you're going to all of a sudden find a big layer that could be very thin or could be very thick, and it might have shells in it. And then below that, it might be peat or just another stuff that's more naturally occurring from runoff. And then there'll be several layers. And if you can find little bits of wood or leaves or bugs,
Tells you everything.
You can start to then date those. And if you can date the top and the bottom, then you know that this thing happened between those 2 layers.
It's all a question of timing.
Yeah.
That's why we take a break at this point in the show. That's Rhett Butler, He's a geologist and a seismologist at HIGP, the Hawaii Institute of Geophysics and Planetology, in SOAS, the School of Ocean Earth Science and Technology at UH Manoa. And here we are on Research in Manoa, talking about forecasting earthquakes. We're going to get to the second part of that in 1 minute. You'll see.
Hey, Stan Energy Man here. Make sure you tune in on my lunch hour every Friday from noon until 12:30 at least. Maybe I'll go a little long if you got good stuff to share with you. But we'll talk about energy, all kinds of energy. My favorite is hydrogen, and my other favorite is transportation and hydrogen. But we'll talk about all kinds of energy. Be with us every Friday at noon, Stan Energy Man. Aloha.
Hi, I'm Ethan Allen, host of Likeable Science on Think Tech Hawaii. I hope you'll join me each Friday afternoon as we explore the amazing world of science. We bring on interesting guests, scientists from all walks of life, from all walks of science, to talk about the work they do, why they do it, and moreover, why it's interesting to you. What the science really means to your life, its impacts on you, how it's shaping the world around you, and why you should care about it. I do hope you'll join me every Friday at 2 p.m. for Likeable Science.
Okay, I'm forecasting that we're coming back from our break, and bingo, we're back. Isn't that amazing?
Brilliant.
Rhett Butler.
I forget where I was talking.
Okay, so we are able then to get data in various parts of the world.
In particular, where we had those 5 nines, there's a lot of data. Like in the from the Great Sumatra Andaman earthquake, 04, the one that killed 250,000 people. That tsunami,
What year was that?
That was 2004, day after Christmas. Wow. Okay, so all around the Indian Ocean, you can find evidence for that tsunami. And so when you go back to those places, and now you look for paleo tsunamis, you can find evidence for prior tsunamis.
So they're nothing happens in a vacuum.
Right, and so if you see it all around the Indian Ocean, then it probably means that it was truly one of these great magnitude 9 earthquakes. But if you're at a location, some island, and then you see one layer, but you don't see it anyplace else, well, that could have been just a local tsunami, a smaller earthquake, a small magnitude 8. So you really have to, you have to kind of look at the deposits and how big an extent you see them and to correlate them across all of these areas. And so where you can see a broad correlation, you have a stronger view that it's a probability. There's a high chance, high likelihood that really was another 9. But if you only see it on bits and pieces, the likelihood's much lower. So that's where all the mathematics
I was going to ask you about that.
Yes, the mathematics.
This is very sophisticated math now.
Yeah, it became increasingly sophisticated. It started as a simple, what we would call back-of-the-envelope calculation that grew beyond all bounds because just putting forward the idea that one might be able to forecast these and say, people insisted it's mathematically very, very rigorous. And so it kept getting more and more mathematical, and a friend of mine at UH, Neil Fraser, who's not simply just a co-author, but he's really a co-first author because he did all the very elaborate mathematical development using what's called Bayesian theory. So you basically are trying to include all the uncertainties mathematically you can, such that at the end, not only do you have a number, like 1 in 50 or 1 in 10, but you have a bracket on some idea on how good that number is. If it's 1 in 50, but it's between 1 and 50, between 1 to 1 and 1 in 1,000, you don't know anything. But if it's like what we found here, 1 in 9 chance over the next 50 years, well, that's bracketed really about from being 9% to 6 to 12%. So it's really much more tightly bracketed. Yeah. And you can only do that if you really go to all the trouble to do all of this complex mathematics, which, not to bore you with, but it's great and rigorous, but it makes the paper you write incomprehensible.
Well, that takes
I've said that before.
That takes us to the question of why do you write the paper? And where does the paper go?
The paper, this paper started out as a short letter to the seismological research letters, and it grew and grew, and so that it was too long for that. And it comes because you send it in the review, and they say, this very interesting idea, but mathematically you got to justify this and this, and you got to do this, and I say, okay, sure, yeah, whatever. I always just and I never give up. And so we
It's your
then,
job,
it
you're a
got, right, it
scientist.
got bigger, and so we sent it then onto the bulletin of the Seismological Society, and then it got bigger than that, and so we sent it into Geophysical Research, Journal of Geophysics, which
That's a big journal of
big
geology
journal,
and seismology.
very, very prestigious, whatever, you know. But it's very well reviewed. So we went through several more reviews. It took 2 years to write this thing.
Wow.
And in part simply because the reviewers, and they're just doing their job, saying, you have to develop the mathematical infrastructure such that we can believe these numbers. And so it took a lot of effort to really develop the math in a way that, at least from the scientific point of view or the mathematician's point of view, well, that's scientifically valid, you know?
So who are the reviewers? Are they the editorial staff of the journal?
Yeah, I mean, there's every journal has a main editor, and they have co-editors, and then they send it out to review. And typically, you don't know who all your reviewers are. I knew one of the reviewers was Brian Atwater, who did a tremendous amount of work up in the Cascadia area, and he was one of the people involved in discovering this orphan tsunami, that Cascadia earthquake that is potentially the harbinger of the one that may hit Seattle someday, did happen in 1700, and they actually were able to validate that, not only from the local data in Cascadia, but the fact that there was a tsunami that occurred in Japan, and they could never explain it because there was no earthquake that it compared to. But they were able to model it, and so once again, you could, by looking at the local paleo data, you could then compare it to a historical account in Japan. We did not have the historical account in the Western
So
U.S.
when you put it out with the editors and the reviewers and the peer group in general,
Right.
you might be putting it out to somebody in another location who has additional data or who's been through this thought process before,
Right.
who can actually make a contribution to your analysis.
Yeah, actually, Brian Atwater was a very significant contribution because this is his expertise in this paleo tsunami area, which is not mine. I'm a seismologist per se, and I'm seeking information. So he turned me on to dozens of references that I should really be, if I'm going to do this seriously, you really need to look very extensively and make sure you're covering what we know
That's
today.
great. So it improves
So it
the
was
quality of the
fantastic,
paper.
and you thank him, and
Yeah.
it made a huge improvement in the paper because I had to sit there and read another 50 papers, and distill everything, and then you have to mathematically model it, and you go through the whole process. But to make a long story short, not to shorten anything because this is fun, for each of the nines, if you just do the calculations and do the models of the paleoseismic data and then compare it to our plate tectonic model, which is entirely separate, you basically get the same numbers.
So that's
So
confirmation.
it's at least validation. It doesn't mean it is correct, but there's a preponderance
Feel
of
better
evidence
about
that,
it.
well, just simple plate tectonics way to divide up the Earth, and we've seen these things, and then you actually look at what we have seen, and if you get some correspondence, it makes you feel like there is some scientific
It's an
validity.
aha moment, isn't
So
it?
I'm always, it doesn't mean it's true. It's still a theory, okay? But it's at least scientifically a way to look at the problem that is self-consistent.
Okay, so in a paper like this, you're going to make forecasts.
Right.
That's where the forecast will
Right.
be, and they'll be scientifically supported, the best we can do, not only
Right.
you, but as the community of seismologists.
Right.
And so question, suppose there's something in there that says, for example, I don't know, the San Andreas Fault's going to fall down one day soon. I don't know, whatever it is. Whether it's directly or by reference to a 9 somewhere else. So question, I'm just throwing it as an
that's
example.
okay.
So what happens? Do we have the, scientific extension, to get out there and permeate the community with this notion so that politically, economically, community-wise, we actually do something about it, or is
Right.
it's just informational only?
Well, it's not, I was motivated by this in part by the idea that although we could model what the potential damage would be, and they've done that for the state through the civil defense and through the city of Honolulu, of how much damage, and it's a huge number. It's if one of these worst case things happens, it's maybe $24 billion. But you don't
Say nothing about loss of life.
Yeah, and will affect hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah.
But that's a number. You can't put what the risk is without the probability of the event itself. So part of the real motivation behind this whole thing is say, well, if we're going to turn this into a risk, and we want to compare the risk from a great tsunami with the risk from a great hurricane, with the risk from a terrorist attack or what, you got to put it all in the same thing. And so to turn damage into risk, you have to have the probability, because risk is the multiplication of the forecast probability and the amount of damage. So 24 billion, about 1 in 10 chance. Well, in the next 50 years, your risk is about, it's it's a huge number.
Yeah, yeah. And you know who'd be interested in that? Insurance companies.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing like, I'm on the Hawaii Earthquake Advisory Committee, and so I presented the information, and once again, so they get to fold it into the civil defense thinking. And I haven't talked really to the insurance companies, but I'd be happy to, because it's, that's part of why you're trying to do this stuff. You're trying to actually put scientifically reasonable, valid numbers on things that are hard to get your hands on. So, like I say, if you have one of these events, it's going to be bad, but there's only a small chance, okay? But even if there is a small chance, and maybe if you just say every year your chances are tens of millions of dollars, well, it behooves you to think about spending some money to lower those risks.
And you means the government, probably.
Yeah.
And there's this thing called the Pacific Risk Management Ohana. Back in March. Primo.
Yes,
it's not like a beer, but it's really a conference.
Yeah.
Where they talk about that.
Yeah.
And it's all about bringing all these disciplines together,
Right.
trying to manage it. And a lot of the disciplines are not from the scientific community, but from the community that will help us survive, help us recover after
Right.
we have one of these experiences. And I guess the question I put to you is, and they need to know what you're saying, because
Right.
they have to convince people. It's an advocacy issue,
Oh, yeah.
really. Convince people that this kind of protection and recovery has to be higher, perhaps on the priority list than it already is. And the only way they're going to actually, latch onto that is knowing
Right.
the forecast.
Right, and knowing what that forecast, what the risk implies.
Yeah.
Because then you can, resources are always limited, the amount of time we have to do stuff. But things that, if you can rate them by, how many dollars or lives are at risk, and the risk meaning you can calculate in a fair sense the probability or the forecast, it gives you some guide then of how to balance your resources, how to use your time and your resources in a way that potentially mitigates.
But it's not static, is it, Rhett?
Correct.
It's not static.
No,
and
it's
you,
not at
you
all.
publish the paper has certain algorithms in it, certain
Right.
forecasts, but this could change, does change. What do you do when you find out that it is changing?
Well, the way science works, at least in my mind, is that it's not until somebody else does it independently and gets basically the same result, it's up there for question. I've tried very hard to make sure it's a very, very scientifically valid case with excellent mathematics and all this other stuff. But there's nothing like another individual looking at the same problem and maybe taking a slightly different approach. But if they come up with the same numbers, it makes it much stronger. You never ultimately prove anything, but in the science, it's not like it's a competition in the sense that, yes, I suppose there's a competition to do it first. But it's unless a lot of scientists come to the same conclusions, you don't have a strong case. So part of it is to get people to look at it, to send out preprints, to get people looking at these things, and to really talk about it such that other people can look at it.
It's a group experience.
It's a group experience.
And it is
there's not a final answer here.
Yeah.
As you say, it's a process, and somebody else, I'm sure, will look at it, and they may come up with a slightly different view, but that's science.
That's the beauty of science.
If we converge, that's great.
Rhett Butler, a geologist and a seismologist, protecting us ultimately here on Research in Manoa. Forecasting earthquakes.
Forecasting.
Earthquakes. Thank you so much, Rhett.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, always.
Bye-bye.